Welcome, everybody, to our day of panel discussions, The World We Want to Live in. Thank you all so much for coming. For those of you here at the beautiful House of Sweden, the Ambassador Allen will introduce the event and kick it off for us. Ambassador Allen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor for us to host you here at the Embassy of Sweden. I really love the name of your institute, Institute of Current World Affairs. It's a little bit of an, in the microphone, you know, it's a little bit too high quality. I love that. It says Institute of Current World Affairs. And I just wanted to say a few words. I know that everyone thinks, you know, that I'm just going to say welcome, hey, bye-bye. But I'm the Swedish ambassador. So I really need to take the opportunity, you know, to say a few words. And since you will discuss the current world affairs, I just want to give you a little bit of my personal reflections about where we are in the current world affairs. I have a background as a politician back home in Sweden. And when I was young, you know, the world was full of opportunities. Everything looked bright and sunny. Soviet Union was gone. I traveled around in the former Soviet Union promoting democracy and met people that really wanted to create great societies and so on. And we all believe that liberal market economy has won, and liberal market economies will create a middle class, and the middle class will ask for human rights and democracy, and we will live happily ever after. That is not the situation we are living in today. We are living in where authoritarian states are, you know, gaining room in the world society, where state capitalistic societies are threatening us and even doing a good job. I'm thinking about China here. We thought, you know, the liberal market economies were the ones that could be innovative because we have open societies and creativity, democracy. And still, we are in a fierce competition with China. Think about it, when we talked about social media some years ago, we said, wow, this is gonna empower ordinary people. Everyone will be able to take part in a democratic conversation. This is a huge democratization in the world. And it will destroy the Chinese Communist Party because they will never be able to keep all this information away from the Chinese people. Today, we are nervous that the apps and the social media we are using are used by the Chinese to influence our thinking and our democratic society. That's where we are. That's something for an institute of current world affairs to think about. How are we coming back to the situation where actually democracy and human rights, liberal market economy, is a beacon for people around the world? A beacon that delivers for people, that people feel that this is good. It actually brings something to me. I don't need to wish for an authoritarian leader to take care of this and fix my, you know, income, my prices, or the life I'm living, or my unemployment. I believe democracy can deliver for me. We need to come back to that. So that's a big change. And I really hope you will have a great day today to discuss that. The other one is the trade. After the Second World War, we decided that we should have open trade, have it as free as possible. We created lots of institutes around the world, Bretton Woods, WTO, and so on. It has been a huge success. We have lifted hundreds and hundreds of millions of people from super poor situation. We have lifted hundreds of millions from poverty. We are all much richer now than we were 1 minute ago. We are much richer now than we were 10 years ago. The world has been, you know, amazingly having created wealth because of this free trade. And now we see all over the world people criticizing this. Globalization is dead. We need to, you know, throw it all over and start over. Talks about protectionism, tariffs, customs, and so on. And there are lots of, you know, explanations to it. I don't say anything else. We thought China, when they entered into WTO in 2001, would adhere to all the rules, that we should have a level playing field. but we know that they have engaged in kind of unfair trade with us. Of course, that has to be addressed. We know that COVID showed us that supply chains weren't that sustainable after all. We had problems. Even in Sweden, I can tell you, we had orders in the beginning of COVID that was stopped in Germany because the German politicians said, we don't know if we want to deliver these things, from Germany to Sweden. It was fixed in a day, but still, we were shocked. Sweden and Germany are the best trading partners in Europe. And of course, we believe if we buy something from you that we need to protect our people, we will get it, okay? But that showed how sensitive it is and the supply chains. So I do understand the politicians all around the world is saying, hey, we need to look at this. The Chinese are playing us. COVID showed us the supply chains are not there. We need to take care of our national security and so on. But maybe it's to take a little bit too far saying that, upholstered furniture factories are important for our national security. That's maybe to take it a little bit too far, right? And that's where we are today in the discussion. So we are living in a totally new world order. Democracy is not longer a beacon of hope for many people. They are looking for authoritarian leaders to fix their problems. And we are in a total broken trading system that we don't really know how we're going to fix. Good luck with your conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Allen, for that very, very sobering message. And yes, the Institute of Current World Affairs we're going to sort it all out. Welcome again to the House of Sweden. Thanks again to the Swedish Embassy for hosting us here. My name is Gregory Pfeiffer. I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs, or ICWA, as we call it. And we are just absolutely delighted to be here. It's wonderful to see you all here for this important day of discussions on the occasion of our 100th-year anniversary. We were founded in on October 10th, 1925. In addition to being the director of the Institute, I am also a journalist. One of my postings was as NPR Moscow correspondent, but before that, I was also an Institute fellow in Russia a quarter century ago. The Institute has advanced the understanding of global cultures and affairs for a century by providing outstanding young professionals with 2-year independent writing fellowships abroad. Fellows undergo deep cultural immersion, gaining firsthand experience that enables them to become leading experts on international societies. One of the great things about the fellowship, at least as I experienced it, other fellows may disagree, and we have quite a few of our fellows here with us, is that fellows are encouraged to be nimble and flexible and follow their research where it leads them, even if it takes their work away from the original plan. The first day of my fellowship coincided with the very first day of Vladimir Putin's presidency on January 1st, 2000. And I was able to switch my fellowship rationale from the original plan of examining the intersection of culture and political rhetoric to essentially traveling around the country for 2 years and methodically observing the quite rapid transformation toward authoritarianism. I was able to go all over Russia, the largest country in the world by territory, and to many other former Soviet republics, something that I really couldn't do as an impoverished reporter for an English language newspaper in Moscow. It helped lay the foundation for my career as NPR correspondent and in other posts in a way that really very few other experiences could have. It enabled me to observe Putin's just sort of step-by-step stifling of free speech, his exploitation of corruption, and his use of fear to marginalize his opposition and coerce the population. Putin cast the takeover as nothing to do with politics. It was just ostensibly a business affair, with the Kremlin claiming the station was losing its shareholders' money. In fact, it was right out of the authoritarian playbook, and his successful operation was a model for the seizure of other industries in Russia, and it's something that we've seen again and again in other countries across the world, and we continue to see today. My fellowship was just exactly the kind of on-the-ground experience that our founder, the diplomat and philanthropist Charles Crane, most valued. He was a close friend and advisor to President Woodrow Wilson, and he founded the Institute in 1925 to inform America's understanding of world affairs in its new role as a global power. Back then, we knew little about large parts of the globe. Today, in a world awash in information, together with disinformation and propaganda, but short on critical context and explanation, and often even the language to describe the current transformation of global societies, we feel that the fellowship is more important than ever. So as we mark our 100th anniversary at a time that the world is experiencing major geopolitical change, as the ambassador laid out, it's amazing to have so many of our alumni here. They've had their on-the-ground experiences that helped lay the foundations of their brilliant careers. And we're lucky to hear from them for a day of discussions examining some of the biggest challenges facing global society and key questions for advancing democracy, a sustainable environment, equitability, and culture at a pivotal moment in our history. With that, I'd like to get to our first panel, the new political movements. A tidal wave of change is transforming the global order and fueling tremendous uncertainty about the future. In a world of fast-changing new political realities, how do we shore up liberalism in traditional democracies? And how do we advance it elsewhere? What do historical perspectives tell us about the current upheavals? We have a really outstanding panel to discuss these issues. Eve Fairbanks. Eve, can you raise your hand, please? Is a writer, journalist, and a senior editor at Foreign Affairs magazine. During her ICWA fellowship in 2009 to 2011, she investigated medicine, politics, and social change in South Africa. Her first book, The Inheritors, An Intimate Portrait of South Africa's Racial Reckoning, won the PEN John Kenneth Galbraith Prize in 2023. She's been published by the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, and other outlets. Catherine Roth-Kono, at the end, was a longtime correspondent and editor at the Associated Press. She now divides her time between New York and Japan. During her fellowship, from 1993 to 1995, she explored Islamic movements in North Africa and the Middle East. And she's also worked for Reuters and elsewhere, and she's currently an Institute trustee. Emily Schultheis is a journalist for Politico, and she's also an ICWA trustee. After reporting from California about elections and democracy, she recently moved to Berlin, also for Politico. Berlin was also her base during her ICWA fellowship from 2019 to 2021, when she reported on the rise of right-wing populism across Germany and also a number of other Central European countries. Emily has written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, and other publications. And our moderator, Andrew Tabler, is a senior fellow with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He served in the State Department and as director for Syria at the National Security Council's Middle East Affairs Directorate. His ICWA fellowship in Lebanon and Syria in 2005 to 2007 focused on politics and reform efforts, and actually got him kicked out of Syria, he was telling me yesterday. And he is the author of In the Lion's Den, an eyewitness account of Washington's battle with Syria, and he's written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications as well. So the panelists will talk for half an hour to 45 minutes. We will finish with a Q&A with the audience, and then we'll take questions over Zoom as well if we have time. For those joining virtually, please type your questions into the chat box. And for all of those of you here, I request that you please identify yourself when asking questions, as well as your affiliation, and stick to one brief question. Thank you very much, and now over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to all of you with the Institute for putting together this wonderful program. As Greg mentioned, I was a fellow in Lebanon and Syria, and like Greg, my fellowship started with a bang, 14 days after I started in Lebanon, and I was traveling the Damascus Road that day. Rafiq Hariri, the former prime minister of Lebanon, and a friend of mine was killed in a massive bomb blast in downtown Beirut, and that set off a whole different fellowship than the original one that I had proposed and envisioned, and ultimately, as Greg mentioned, led to me getting kicked out of the country, which was the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of my profession. I got a chance to get out of Syria before the uprisings kicked off, and a chance to write about it here in Washington. But it certainly didn't help the Syrian people, who have suffered tremendously as a result of years of indecision by the Western countries in particular, but not only. And now we have, of course, the fall of the regime, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I would just like to say to Greg and everyone at ICWA last night at dinner how struck I was suddenly realizing how Peter Martin would have absolutely loved to have been here with us today. And he is with us here today, and all of us that worked with Peter. Peter was a character, as we say in Western Pennsylvania, and I think he, before the world and our educational institutions produced people that seemed like robots, he was anything but. And he really just he loved to grab readers by the lapels. He liked to grab fellows by the lapels, only metaphorically, of course, because I used to fight with him like cat and dog, and we just went back and forth and back and forth. But there was never a doubt that Peter ultimately wanted to support us. So I would just like to take a moment of silence in remembrance of him and his impact on all of us here today. Okay, thank you. So, fellowships. We're going to start out with the fellowships themselves, and then move into the theme of the panel. We have a great panel here today. I've so much looked forward to doing this. I talk and write for a living, unfortunately, or for better or for worse. I started out like Greg in journalism, and then moved into policy, and I kind of go between the two places. ICWA changed my life. It changed me from being a journalist into being a policymaker, so to getting kicked out of Syria, but it's another story. And ultimately, it trained me in long-form journalism, which was just kind of not so much a large jump to writing on policy in a more succinct way. And so, my first question to our panelists here today, and Emily, we can start with you because you've been most recently in the field. What about your fellowship, which was about 5 years ago, is that right, or so?
Finished 4 years.
4 years ago, okay, has stuck with you?
That's a big question. First of all, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. I moved to Germany about 2 years before my ICWA fellowship. So shortly after Donald Trump took office in the U.S., and we were thinking about the rise of far-right populist parties across the West. And so I had been reporting on those as a freelance journalist before I started ICWA. And I think, the impact that this fellowship had on me, and the thing that's so special about it, is that when you're a freelance journalist, you are on a tight budget, you are on a tight timeline, you are trying to tell a story and tell it quickly. And ICWA gave me the time to slow down and to spend time in some of the communities that I was writing about. And so, for example, I went and spent a month living in a small city in eastern Saxony, right along the Polish border. And I had chosen that city because it came very close to electing the first far-right mayor in Germany a couple of months before that. And I think there's something really special about being able to go somewhere with a question and not necessarily feel that you have to already have the answers in front of you. And so my question was, why is it that 45% of people in this city voted for the far right? I got to know a few people when I started. They introduced me to other people. I spent a month talking to not just the people who show up and scream loudly at a political rally, but a school teacher and someone who worked in the local bookshop, and people who saw some of these sort of burgeoning far-right leaders in this city as, this is my neighbor, how could this be a bad guy? And there was a feeling that some of the concerns that they had were not being heard at the national level in politics, and that as a result they were being sort of demonized for feeling differently. And I think there's something about having had those conversations, and like I say, there's a difference between the people who show up with the signs and yell loudly at a political rally and the people who are maybe not so loud about it but are voting for some of these parties, that has really stuck with me about the understanding of where some of these feelings come from. And I think that is something that, as we have seen since my fellowship, the far right in Germany is now coming in first in some polls nationally, which I would not have even imagined then. Parties in Austria, for example, where I also reported, this is something that we've seen a continuation of this trend in a way that I think taking some time to embed in a community and understand what's happening at that level is really crucial.
Yeah. I mean, I think I had the same experience during my fellowship. I think I learned to get out of my comfort zone in Damascus and get out into Deir ez-Zor, and ultimately where the country actually came apart later on. And actually it taught me something interesting about this country, because it wasn't too long ago when everybody would just talk about flyover states from the podium, right? And people who in DC and New York and so on. But now the center of the country I think people are trying to get back in touch with what's going on there because of the same deindustrialization and the other problems we have are similar to those that happened in East Germany, right? Or with former East Germany. So thank you very much for that. Eve?
Is this on?
It is.
Yes, great. Okay. I just want to stress, I think it can almost be understated just how rare this kind of fellowship is, in that it's 2 years, really rare amount of time to get. And my experience, I was a fellow in South Africa from 2009 to 2011, and I wrote letters. My main form of intellectual production was to write letters to the director at the time. And I ended up writing about, I had come from Washington, I'd been at the New Republic, and I'd really felt in myself and seen in other people a very strong split that you sometimes then see come out into the open, but mostly not, between what journalists and what writers privately thought of the people that they were covering, of politics, and what they were sort of willing to publicly say, right? And I myself participated in that. We have to participate in a kind of professional brand building, a public discourse, and then there's the private. And what ICWA really did, that for me, among the things that was so interesting, was it collapsed that. I think many people become very close to former fellows, to their directors, and I wrote to Steve, at the time my director. I mean, he learned about my love life, he learned about when somebody broke into my apartment, he learned about riffs I'd had with people, and yet I cannot understate how much it transfigured my writing, the way I think about the world. The book I ended up writing on South Africa, my now husband is a major figure in it, in ambiguous roles at times, and his father, people who I got to know in a human way and had human feelings about. I ended up writing that book, and I still do a lot of journalism this way, about 90% text messages. I was so excited by this sort of letter writing, this feeling of writing directly to people that I would only have experienced from my fellowship, gave me the chance to experience that. That I threw away 2 drafts of this book that were 120,000 words, and I rewrote the whole thing, just thinking, okay, I'm not a journalist, I'm a human being, just that's been living as a foreigner, as someone who now speaks a couple local languages in this place. And what would I just say to someone just that I'm talking to, my parent, my friend at dinner? And I rewrote the whole book that way in WhatsApp to a particular friend of mine who I'd met in Kenya. So this entire book has been written in WhatsApp messages. And I learned that from my fellowship. And I think if one reads it, it doesn't feel like emoji-laden WhatsApps, but it just finally felt for me like I was able to sort of express what I was really seeing, my own feelings about the people that I was meeting, and the length of the interactions that I had with them. In one case, I had such a long interaction with a man that I was writing about as a journalist, that he orchestrated a situation where he sent me to tell his parents that he had committed a murder when he was a teenager. There were just these deep, and it was through that I understood the level of shame that he had about being an Afrikaner and the things that he had done in the military in South Africa. None of this, I mean, it was just so different from things that I learned as a journalist. It transfigured my work completely. And I think it's easy to sort of underrate that and say, okay, it's special because it's 2 years long. It's such a special fellowship.
Yeah, that's I think really well said. Overcoming what we see as maybe self-censorship, but I think more importantly, just more basically, a fear of expressing yourself and what you're actually seeing. Not necessarily the kind of fear that you would face in an authoritarian system, as in imprisonment or death, but just getting fired, which is a real thing, right? And everybody is in that.
Or embarrassing yourself. Or
Exactly.
seeming like you don't know enough.
Or you can embarrass yourself first, then get fired, then get rehired. Who knows? These days, everything's up for grabs. So, Catherine.
When I started my fellowship, I had been a freelance reporter in Cairo for 3 years. And I started to see Islamic movements bubbling up and had met some people. And I was very curious about what was happening. And my editors had absolutely zero patience for hearing about it. They said, we don't want to hear about that. Just tell us about the bomb-throwing crazies. And literally, word for word, Tampa Tribune, that's what they wanted. But I had a feeling there was a little more to that, and I'd met some people. And ICWA took a chance on a crazy idea, which was that I proposed a 2-year fellowship kind of starting based in Cairo, because that's what I knew, but then spending a year in Algeria in '93, and then Yemen in '94. And that's where I spent a lot of my fellowship. And then I visited some other countries because ICWA allows one to do that. And when I was just about the time I was leaving to start my fellowship, the first attack happened on the World Trade Center. So yeah, things were happening. And I went to Algeria, and there I was, alone in Algeria, trying to, what am I doing here? How am I going to do this? And I remember, so I just met people and had tea and started to feel my way around. And Peter, who was our director then, I said, Peter, I feel really guilty. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm meeting a lot of people, and I'm having tea, and I'm talking a lot about things and listening very carefully. But I feel like I should be doing more. And he said, nope, just keep doing that. That is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Just keep listening and paying attention and thinking about things. And wow, when you have 2 years to do that, you start to listen in a different way. You start to pick up nuance in a different way. You start to question assumed realities in a certain way. And I started to realize that the Islamists I was seeing in Algeria, there was nothing old-fashioned and traditional about them. They were a new something coming up. and the people speaking French wearing suits in the government, there was nothing modern about them. They were old school. They were stepping into colonialist spots, and everything all of a sudden just seemed like it was on its head. And another example of what happens when you have the freedom that ICWA offers you is one of the people I met in Algeria was a young Assyrian Christian who was appalled that I was studying Islamic movements and wasn't visiting minority communities like his. And he was right. And he insisted that I spend Christmas in Aleppo. And I take a month out to visit his Christian villages where his relatives were from and spend a month in Syria, really understanding Christians there. And what other kind of fellowship could give you that freedom? And I did that, and I spent a remarkable month with his family. I'm still in touch with his family after all these years. And it did color the rest of my fellowship, and when I talked to people, I did have that in mind. And the second part of my fellowship, I was in Yemen. So one thing I should say about Algeria, so the civil war started when I was there, and I stayed there. So I was in the Kasbah, I was meeting young Islamists, I was watching as the country started to slip into civil war, which ended up lasting a decade. It was really horrible. About 200,000 people ended up dead at the end of it. But I saw how it started and had a sense of the lay of the land. And I realized also that a lot of it was demographics, that anyone over 30 had been educated in French and had certain ideas about the world. And anyone under 30, which was the majority, had been educated in Arabic with their own ideas of the world. And part of it was demographics. Part of the surprise information was that a lot of Islamists were computer geeks. And if anyone remembers what the computers were, what computers and online existence was like in 1993, it was not much. They were sort of the cutting edge of that technology blitz, and they were using it to email each other. Email was not mainstream in those days. My letters to Peter were via fax a lot of times, but Islamists were on the cutting edge of technology, and they were using technology to spread the word. Anyway, so the next part, I went to Yemen, and again, my timing was a little interesting. And 4 weeks after I arrived, civil war broke out in Yemen, and I covered the northern front of the civil war. They were people who were jihadis, the Marxist government in Afghanistan fell in '92, and a lot of the people, both in Algeria, some of them, although I didn't meet them there, and then in Yemen, where I met a lot of them, had come straight from Osama bin Laden's camps in Afghanistan. And they told me that they had been trained there, divided country by country. So he had divided Algerians in one section, Yemenis in one section, and all of a sudden these guys were sent back to their countries, and a lot happened. And one person I met that was a mentor to me in Yemen and really changed everything for me was Jamal Khashoggi. While the civil war in Yemen was not a big deal in the Western press, it was a huge deal in the Arab press. And some of the top Arab reporters were covering the war. And when I met Jamal and I told him about the fellowship and what I was trying to do, and he, by the way, had gone to school in Indiana and had sort of a soft spot for Americans and the Midwest, and I went to school in Wisconsin, so we had that bond. But he thought it was really important that I meet people and understand the nuance of things. And while a lot of those people would not want to have talked to an American infidel like myself, they did really want to talk to him. And he took me under his wing. As he went, every time he'd do a reporting trip, we'd go out, and he would take me along to meet Islamists of various persuasions all over Yemen. And he told them that, I'll interview you for Al-Watan, but first you need to talk to Catherine, because she's on a fellowship and she's trying to understand Islamic movements. Well, so they did. And what I learned through Jamal and the doors he opened for me was that there was an incredible amount of nuance. There were people who were criminals, and they would have been criminals anywhere. And there were other people who were also out of Afghanistan, and Jamal would say, yeah, I know he's the same, but you wait. He's not a bad guy. You just wait and see how that turns out. And he was right. As soon as the Civil War was ended, the person he said, nah, this guy is okay. That guy was leading community meetings about irrigation and helping people with local government. And he had just been doing it to get his family lands back. And as soon as his goal was achieved, he was done. But anyway, the fellowship taught me a lot about how to listen and how to look for nuance. And those lessons stayed with me. So when I was a reporter in the AP, covering different things, including 9/11 and its aftermath, I had a different view of things, and I think it helped me explain things. And this much later, when I'm now spending more time in Japan, which is a total different part of the world, it really colors the way I think about things and the closeness with which I listen. So I would say, even for fellows who end up going to a different region, it has lasting impact in terms of how you're analyzing and thinking about the world. So.
Thank you for those comments. So, in listening to all three of you, I remember reading one of our former fellows, the late David Hapgood's book about Charles Crane, the man who bet on people. It's a wonderful book. Still missing a conclusion, but that's another story. And it was very interesting because when I first came to ICWA, we just had this kind of boilerplate website that looked like the CIA, which was anything but. It was really strange, right? Sometimes things aren't as they appear. Amazing. And I had to figure out what the Institute was all about, so I ordered the book before my, which was hard to get because I was living in Syria at the time. So I sent it to New York. A friend gave it to me, and I read it and I think I was struck in reading that book because I got a sense of what Crane originally intended. Crane wanted us to have deep experiences all over the world because the United States, for better or for worse, is not traditionally a colonial country in the sense of the European powers in the past. People can argue about our economic system, but that's not, we don't have large bureaucracies. We fight all the time about whether to stay in the rest of the world or get out of it, right? And not a lot of other countries do that once they're there. And so what was also struck me was Crane clearly intended not just for us to have deep experiences, but that you must bring them not just to the people of the United States, but ultimately to the people of the world. I think he saw them roughly as not the same thing, but he definitely had this internationalist mindset, right? And so that brings us to, and this I emphasized with Peter during my fellowship, whatever we're doing at the end of a fellowship, there has to be a point to this, right? There has to be an impact. There has to be something we're bringing to the public to make the world a better place. Otherwise, it gets too internal. And I think and that brings us kind of to the theme, right, of what we're talking about here today. And that is concerning, we can start out with Emily. And ultimately, it deals with your countries of fellowship. But in case of Catherine, you've moved on, and we're going to hear about where you're currently living at least part of the time. So, what do you see as the salient political directions in your fellowship countries or adopted countries now, as pertains to liberal democracy and its trajectory? Emily?
Yeah, I think, so I was covering the 2025 German elections, so this last February when Vice President J.D. Vance came to the Munich Security Conference a few days before that election and essentially gave what amounted to a campaign speech for the far-right Alternative for Germany party, speaking about how European leaders did not realize that the greatest security threat to them was, quote, the threat from within. And I think there is, so when we talk about the salience of, in my case, in my particular fellowship and the topic that I was writing about, I think it has been fascinating to watch, particularly over the course of this year with the Trump administration back in office, the extent to which previous efforts to link far-right parties to learn from each other rhetorically, operationally, legally in some cases, how what felt like there was sort of a behind-the-scenes attempt to do that in Trump's first term has now become very concrete. And so whether it's getting involved in the Romanian presidential election earlier this year, whether it was showing up in Munich and meeting with one of the heads of the far-right party just days before the election, I think there is, I think that some of the parallels between societies and the parallels between the kind of core argument and sort of core appeal of parties like these have become very explicit. And I think coming back to the fellowship and sort of what I learned in that sense, I had covered the 2016 election in the US, but largely from DC, from a desk, rather than from out around the country. I was working for CBS News at the time, doing mostly breaking news. And for me, in a way, going around as an ICWA fellow and talking to far-right voters in Germany, I'm like, I could have heard this in Iowa. Obviously, the exact issues are a little bit different, but some of the kind of core fears and anxieties that underpin that are fundamentally the same across a lot of countries. And so I think if we want to talk about what one can take away from, in my case, particularly my fellowship, I think these are political undercurrents that are present in a lot of places, and we are now seeing the explicit ties between them in ways that are novel and still evolving.
And so, because your fellowship ended just 4 years ago, and a lot has happened in 4 years in Germany, right? People always ask me the same question about Syria. Could you see this coming? Could you see what transpired, or was it just echo? How did it come across to you as you were gathering this information and this experience?
Yeah, so I mentioned this town that I spent the time in Eastern Germany, and so Eastern Germany was a place where the far right became sort of socially and politically acceptable several years earlier than that process began in the western part of the country, and there's many reasons for sort of the political differences between the two, and I wrote a lot about that at the time. But I think, Germany is unique in a lot of ways in that, given its history, its constitution and its political system is set up to prevent the rise of extremist parties in the future. And so I think
for good reason.
Yes, there's a very specific reason for that. And I think, that it has been interesting to watch the ways in which this party has sort of bumped up against some of those safeguards. And I think what we have seen since the end of my fellowship is I think that those safeguards still exist, that sort of what we call the firewall, the Brandmauer, but I think there are cracks in it, and I think the cracks are widening, and the acceptability of working with this party on the local level, where it's your neighbor, or it's the guy down the street, or it's the school teacher, you're starting to see that kind of trickle up is maybe not quite the right phrasing, but I think I think that some of the seeds of that kind of social and political acceptability were already underway when I was there, and what we've seen in the 4 years since then is that has expanded not just in specific local communities and not just in the eastern part of the country, but we're really seeing it across Germany.
Eve?
Yeah, I emailed when we got this this topic on how your fellowship country relates to shoring up liberal democracy. First of all, it's been very weird for South Africans to see their country turned into a sort of symbol in such an unrecognizable way. A very, very, I think, strange experience that's had maybe a salutary impact.
You mean internationally? A symbol?
Yeah,
yes,
in the
yeah.
U.S.
In the U.S.
And
yeah.
in Australia, but the sort of, not just the plight of a certain class of white citizens, but even claims about the democracy down there, because there's not really some of the discussions that we think of here as global, as existent, as sort of critical, as pertaining to the whole world, to everyone, such as the rise of interest in authoritarianism, the rise of the appeal among young people, the sense of a loss of faith in democracy. Those are just not discussed there in the same way, because it's so obvious. They have South Africans have such a close, near in time, visceral experience with a lot of the types of movements that are gaining interest here, gaining traction in North America, in the West, and they'll look at our politics, they'll look at European politics and think like, God, why would you guys do that? You know, we tried that. It was really bad. It was really bad for, our economy collapsed. They had protectionism, partly imposed by sanctions, but they had a protectionist economy, which turned into a kind of absurdity and fell apart. They had a technocratic, a kind of oligarchic technocratic society. The apartheid government didn't conceive of itself as a racist regime, or didn't sell itself that way. It really sold itself, and and many of people in it conceived of themselves as technocrats, as futuristic, as people who are going to use physical and social engineering to create a better, a society where people had more opportunities to make great companies, to flourish, to become whatever. This also just turned into a sort of, South Africans have a huge sense of humor, a kind of ludicrous clown car and disaster. And so, and which Elon Musk and Peter Thiel's parents had to flee. And so they look at then, certain kind of things that are gaining, the idea, there was a Pew poll that came out, I think a year ago, saying young Americans would love to have, not love to have, but a majority say they're starting to feel like a strong military regime would be more effective than a democracy. And for South Africans, that's just like, dude, guys, we tried it. It really didn't work. And they, I think, really, people have come to the feeling that, of Churchill, that democracy stinks, but it's by far the least bad potential option. And so when I was thinking about, how shoring up liberal democracy, people really feel, I think, not that the democratic era has delivered materially, that's something different, but that the basic freedom to choose your leaders, to work in the fields that you would like to work in, because of course Black South Africans of color were not allowed to own almost any kind of business or work in any kind of field, except a few until the early 1990s, that these are just, they offer so much that there's a bit of a feeling when South Africans look at the West, including most white South Africans, that we now take it for granted. And also that, that there's things that one has to do oneself as a citizen to kind of help preserve that. And I'll just say, too, South Africans really believe in distrusting government. They think distrust of institutions and distrust of leaders is a vital component of shoring up liberal democracy. And of course it's complex, and of course there's a balance. But it's something that surprised me when I got down there, was there's a lot of concern, which I think can be warranted, around the loss of trust in experts, loss of trust in institutions, loss of trust in the political class there. South Africans, for some reason they've decided, young South Africans, that the nickname for their president, Cyril Ramaphosa, is Cupcake. When he goes to speak at universities, when he goes to speak at schools, people over the course of his speech will start in the audience, Cupcake, Cupcake, we love you, Cupcake. And it's a kind of irreverence. It's a kind of acknowledgement that politicians are also like you, and that you have to keep an eye on them, that nobody's going to be your savior. People have to keep being replaced. The last thing I'll just say is there's a different feeling about freedom of speech in South Africa, which again is that there are some freedoms, such as choosing your own leaders, being able to work where you want to work, that are extremely important, that are fundamental, that are non-negotiable. There's no interest in a return to authoritarianism. But there are some that you have to be more careful of in order to preserve those deeper ones. There are laws in South Africa that we would consider possibly infringing on freedom of speech. There's a law against insulting or offending or assaulting someone else's dignity. It's called crimen injuria. It's a unique law in South Africa. You can be prosecuted for racist speech. People are quite careful in how they do interviews on the radio. There aren't shock jocks. And I think people consider that a component of maintaining a liberal democracy is ensuring that your expression doesn't impinge on other people, ensuring that you give your fellow citizens the benefit of the doubt. So it's a country that has a lot to teach, I think.
Catherine.
Okay, so this is the Ultimate Institute of Current World Affairs Challenge. I am going to pivot from Islamic movements in the 90s to Japan today. I have been a part of a Japanese family for 30 years almost. I've raised two bicultural, biracial Japanese children, and I've watched things change a lot. I just returned from Japan Monday night, and I was there when the naming of the new prime minister. And as you said with regard to South Africa, with regard to Japan, they're also conscious of conserving their precious liberal democracy, and they are seeing what's happening in other parts of the world, which some parts closer than others, and they don't want that to happen there. And things are going slowly, and they're keeping an eye on things, but it's going carefully. And one thing Japanese were very upset about was all the fuss in the Western press about a first woman prime minister. And they did not think that was the most important thing about her. And they were upset at how shallow the U.S. media was to just focus on that one thing. Because their new prime minister has been a trained politician. She's slogged it out in the field for 40 years. She is one of the first prime ministers from a normal blue-collar, working-class family. She has a policewoman, was her mom, and her dad worked in a car factory, as opposed to other politicians who are from wealthy and multi-generational political families. So Japanese think that's very important. And she's well-educated. She did an internship here in Washington with Pat Schroeder way back when, and she wrote Pat Schroeder and said, I would like to be Prime Minister of Japan, believe it or not, in the 80s, and that was a preposterous dream, ridiculous. And she wrote to Pat Schroeder and said, I was so moved by you crying on TV when you stepped out of the race that that I want to be Japanese Prime Minister, and Pat Schroeder hired her for an internship. And she had that vision, and she kept up with it. Anyway, for Japan, where they don't have identity politics, being there made me realize there are limits to identity politics. And while it's amazing to see underrepresented people in government, it sometimes can detract from the fact that they're very able and they're good at what they do, and that's more important than their identity. And the Japanese cabinet also named, in something that hasn't been mentioned much in the media, their first American-born cabinet member, who is biracial. She was born in Chicago. She looks like my kids. And for me, I guess that tells something about how homogenous Japan is, that a half-white cabinet member is a kumbaya moment for me. But yeah, so Japan is moving forward and bringing in more people. But it's also very conscious that liberal democracy is under siege in a lot of the world, and they don't want that to happen. So they're taking it slow. But I do feel like they're keeping their eye on safety and democracy, and maybe that's okay.
Okay, very well said. Thank you. So we'll now move to questions from the audience. We have microphones available, so if you could just stick your hand up as high as you can. Stand up, sorry, I stand corrected. Well, I'm not standing, but you will. Please stand up and raise your hand, and we'll go with the first question.
Hi, my name is Roland. I'm a current fellow. My fellowship was to the Netherlands for 6 months, Portugal for 6 months, and I've been 6 months in Brazil, and I have another 6 months there. And I'm looking at drug policy and how we can solve the opioid crisis here, given the experiences in those countries. But one of the things that I've seen outside of the drug policy is the rise of the far right in all of these countries, right? And something, Emily, that you talked about was how you were hearing the same arguments in Germany as you did in Iowa. I actually campaigned in Iowa. I've campaigned in Maine and California and Missouri and other places. And one of the things that's been fascinating to me is seeing that whether you're in the Netherlands, whether you're in Portugal, or whether you're in Brazil, it's almost always the same conversation when you're talking with folks from the far right, and so or from the growing right, because they're really taking over that side. And my question has been, does that have something to do with social media? Is it because they're all kind of listening to the same social media folks? And it kind of goes to your question about, or your point about South Africa and limiting speech. You know, in Brazil, they do have stricter freedom of speech where if you, for example, you can't say, you know, my opponent is part of an armed faction, which is a big deal in Brazil. The Supreme Court will take that down because you don't have proof or so forth. And so I guess the first question is, sorry, Greg, there are two questions here. But the first is like, is it a social media thing? Is that what's tying them all together? And how does free speech, play into that?
First of all, nice to see you in person. I guess I would say that there's two pieces to this, right? I think social media absolutely fuels this. It makes it easier for people to understand what kind of messaging is working in one place and bring it to another place, or to be influenced by what's happening elsewhere. I wrote at one point about the QAnon conspiracy here in the US, how there was someone who was just translating it word for word into German and posting YouTube videos, and that's how German kind of far-right, extreme right conspiracy theorists were importing ideas that word for word, translated word for word, that were happening here. But I think the other piece of it that's really important, and I think this is something that that I hadn't quite expected in my ICWA fellowship, but that having that fellowship time kind of made clear to me. I think you can have the fuel to a fire, but you have to have that fire. You have to have that spark in the first place. And I think something that unites all of these countries is sort of a backlash to and a fundamental unease with the ways in which societies are changing. I think migration is a big piece of that. That looks a little bit different in every place. I also spent a little time in Portugal ahead of the 2024 election, and I think, there's such a different history with immigration there than there is in Germany, than there is in Amsterdam, and yet it was changing. And I think there was this sense that people who, the to use kind of the populist term, the true people, the sort of long-standing national and in some cases ethnically based identity was facing challenges. And so this question of who gets to belong to our society and who doesn't, and who gets to define that, I think some of this is that there is a desire among people who are supporting these kinds of parties to redefine that in a more restrictive way, in response to some of the bigger demographic changes that are happening. So I think it's both. I think having that kind of unease and those feelings are present in a lot of these societies. And then the fact that you do have access to social media is making it easier for things to spread beyond country borders.
It's a really good question. I'll try to have a narrow thought. I got to South Africa in 2009, and there is a white right there that's really not as big as you might think from people who go on TV here to represent the country. And I also grew up in a very intellectual conservative family, but where there was exposure to a lot of Rush Limbaugh in the 1990s and sort of a little bit more ex-John Birch. And so this was pre-social media. When I got to South Africa, I found that some of this kind of some far-right rhetoric felt quite familiar. And I guess one thought I had is that it felt as though some on the right had borrowed a narrative from the left, having perceived it to be very effective. And this narrative was one of we're a minority, we're becoming a minority, we're going to be victimized, erased, elements of that. In South Africa, there was a major group that used to go around the country, and then Europe and the United States, doing a presentation where they would glue furniture to the ceiling. And they would say, now the world is upside down. Now it's white, reverse racism, reverse apartheid against white people, a kind of, and that we need an identity politics. And so it may be that social media has increased that, but there was a kind of familiarity to the story because it had actually been taken from some types of left-wing rhetoric, I think, and converted. So I guess that was, I saw a kind of commonality there. It's one thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I think one thought I have is that that maybe like Islamic movements, people take on certain language and certain signals of authenticity or belonging as a way of expressing that the current system doesn't work. It doesn't work economically for a lot of people. It doesn't work in terms of healthcare for a lot of people.
Yeah, speak into the microphone. There you go.
That maybe there's a way that they're taking this language to express underlying issues that we have in our country that may be more the cause than those outer right-wing symbols that the headlines focus on.
Yeah, I remember returning from my fellowship and being struck, and this was in 2008, coming back, and I had been literally given a crash course in ideology by the Ba'ath Party in Syria, which was not great, by the way, just in terms of their overall agenda and so on. But anyways, I was really struck because the America that I had left 14 years before had overwhelmingly become the role of ideology even in our own society, and how that affected, it might have empowered some, but ostracized others. And in answer to your question, I think it's kind of both ways, right? There are people that are outside the system and feel that way, partially because they always were, partially now because they're finding other people in terms of social media, but partially because they're being pushed there and not included in the future. And ultimately, that comes to affect a lot of things. Greg, you have the next question?
Well, first of all, I want to say what a just really, really interesting conversation this is. But I'm not surprised. You guys are all ICWA fellows. So thank you very much for that. My question is a slightly nebulous, but again, you're ICWA fellows, so you'll find no problem answering that. Andrew asked Emily, when you were in your fellowship, did you foresee what was coming? And I kind of want to ask any of you who want to answer about any of the countries in which you are expert in. What do you foresee, if you foresee anything about the state of our alliances with those countries? There's recent polling in Europe, for instance, that the majority of Europeans, according to the surveys, want their leaders to show backbone in their relations with Washington and push back on tariffs and so on and so forth. At a time when many of their leaders are trying to accommodate the White House. Also at a time that the administration is, as Emily, you were mentioning, seeking sort of alliances, collaboration with right-wing movements in those in those countries. So, do you foresee anything about how our alliances are going to hold up over the foreseeable future? Thank you.
My sense of things is that there's a short-term game and a long-term game. With regard to Japan, I think the new prime minister is really well situated to deal with the current administration and get along better than other leaders of other democratic countries, probably. So in the short term, I think that's their game. But at the same time, they are arming more militarily. I think they are looking more at other alliances in the longer term. There's an expression in Japan, Abe era expression, Japan is back. And that Japan is back feeling is in the air. I think this may be a return of Japan as a more powerful player. So I think in the short term, our alliances are good, and in the long term, I think we should do better and earn our keep. But yeah.
You want to chime in on that?
No, I think that's
No?
That's good. That's
Emily?
good.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just very quickly say, I mean, with regard to Europe, I think the new Trump administration is just an acceleration of a feeling that was already underway in Europe, which was that the United States is not the reliable ally that it has been in the past, and that Europe needs to step up. That's the phrase that you keep hearing, strategic autonomy and stepping up in security. I think there are real questions about what that looks like and how successful they will be in that process, and we are very much in the middle of that right now.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate. I mean, this is bigger than Trump. It can be easy to feel as if it's just the Trump administration that's making this radical move, but there's a lot of shifts in the way the United States approaches alliances and vice versa that are much deeper than that. That's true of South Africa. Obviously, the Trump administration has made itself like a active enemy of the country, but beneath that, the level of frustration among Democrats, the pulling away from South Africa as a sort of special ally, that can be obscured by the Trump effect. So I think one has to keep an eye on things beneath and beyond this administration.
I think we have time for one more question. Is that fair, Greg? Okay, please.
Stanley Kober, as a child of Holocaust survivors, I feel obliged to point out the Holocaust was not the result of social media. Yeah, all of these atrocities happened before. What we are seeing, it seems to me, is something that happened before in history. The Enlightenment followed by the Romantic Rebellion. When Gorbachev was trying to transform the Soviet Union, he said explicitly that perestroika was based on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. This is the Enlightenment. That sentiment is gone. We now have blood and soil. For some reason, blood and soil appeals to the human heart in a way that the abstract ideals of the Enlightenment apparently do not. It seems to me we have to explore that.
Okay. Anybody like to comment on that in your countries in which you're?
I think the way, I mean, thank you for the comments. It's very true what you said. But people in rooms like this, people like us, I myself have asked myself about early stories I wrote about South Africa that were very declinist, very kind of doomy, very predicting a decline. Why did I think that? Why did I write that? Why? Because there are countries such as South Africa where you can see ideals of the Enlightenment have a powerful emotional appeal, and blood and soil has less so. And so why is it possible that there could develop a fixation on the idea that we're in a democratic decline, that everyone else but the kinds of people in this room are losing faith in democracy? That's right. I just wonder why we focus so much on the stories that we do.
I don't know. Emily?
I guess I would just throw one thing in there with regard to the European far right, which is that also to come back to another plug for the ICWA Fellowship, part of what I got to do was spend a lot of time understanding not just the sort of 2016 post-Brexit, post-Trump rise of far-right parties, but to understand that in a lot of places, these parties had a previous heyday in the 80s in Austria with Jörg Haider and with Jean-Marie Le Pen in France. And I do think that there is something, we are currently in what feels like an upswing for a lot of these parties in Europe. My fellowship was during the pandemic. There was an absolute cratering of these parties for about a year and a half in the wake of the onset of the pandemic. And so I think it is, I think there is a lot of discussion about kind of doom and gloom right now, and I think a lot of it is, in fact, there are good reasons for us to be thinking about these developments in that way. But I think there's also if we're speaking just about European far right, but I think this extends to many other countries as well, that there's sort of there's a bit of a cyclical nature of this, and what we're seeing right now is a backlash to some of that. As you mentioned, some of the sort of end of history, fall of the Berlin Wall, democratic era. I don't know what comes next, but I think that it could be that those parties find that they are not, once they get into government, that people are not happy with them, and we'll have to see kind of what the next few years look like on that front.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. As Emily was saying, those parties may not have the longevity that it seems like they will now. There aren't a lot of Islamic states in the Arab world right now. It isn't a liberal democracy kind of a place, but it also isn't a Islamic state, any countries I was in. The other thought I have on a completely different pivot, keeping to the Islamist/Japan theme, is that I feel like now may be payback time. This is when the U.S. investment in Japan's constitution post-World War II, and possibly its investment in Germany. We were debating that earlier. But the investment that America made in making sure that Japan and also Germany had different constitutions and that this wouldn't happen again. Maybe I'm an optimist, too much of an optimist, but I do feel like this may be when we're happy for that investment, that I do feel like Japanese liberal democracy is rock solid, in part because of that constitution. And I am cautiously optimistic that Germany will hang tough and that there's enough memory of what happened that will hold back the floodgates. So, yeah.
Sure. And then to just comment on your very good question, I think that, again, getting back to ideology and its limits, right, and its the threats, I think that some ideologies are elastic and some are inelastic. And when you're faced with an inelastic ideology, sometimes it can't just constrict a political movement. Sometimes it leads to the destruction and mass slaughter of people, right? And that's a real thing. And that's why doing the right thing and observing it for what it is early and acting, in my opinion, is better than not acting. Now, that is as a world, but also within your own societies and including in this country itself. The problem, of course, always is trying to figure out what's the right thing to do in a certain time. But somehow, the one thing I learned during my ICWA fellowship was not just to follow my nose, as Joe Botat told me to do when I first started and recruited me, but was most importantly to listen to my gut. It never steers you wrong, ultimately, and we need to do more of that if I was ever to preach anything to all of you. And with that, I would just like to thank Emily, Eve, and Catherine for speaking from the heart. It has been an honor being on the podium with you here today. And by the authority invested in me by no one, I want to thank you for bringing your ideas to the people of the United States and the world, as Charles Crane originally intended. Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists here today.
Thank you all so much. Fascinating, Andrew. Wonderful moderating. Just terrific. Thank you so much.